I am Ali, 32, a self-made tech entrepreneur who built a fortune from nothing but determination and vision. Growing up in a family that valued only traditional success, my path to building a $22 million company wasn't just about business challenges. It was about surviving the ultimate betrayal from those who should have loved me most. When my own father called me uneducated trash and physically pushed me out of their home, I never imagined that just weeks later, they would show up at my beach house desperate for the help they once scorned. Before I tell you how I went from being kicked out to owning a beach house, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to prove someone wrong. I grew up in a comfortable middle-class neighborhood in suburban Chicago. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family, but appearances can be deceiving. My father, James, was a high school principal known throughout the district for his strict academic standards and traditional values. My mother, Margaret, worked as a college professor in English literature, equally demanding in her expectations. Together, they created an environment where academic achievement wasn't just encouraged, it was the only acceptable path to worth. My older siblings thrived in this atmosphere. Thomas, 4 years older than me, was the golden child, graduating top of his class and eventually becoming a corporate lawyer. Karen, just 2 years my senior, followed closely in his footsteps, becoming a research scientist with multiple published papers before she turned 30. Family dinners often turned into showcases of their latest achievements, while I sat quietly feeling increasingly invisible. From an early age, I knew I processed information differently. Traditional classroom settings felt confining, and although I understood concepts deeply, the standardized ways of demonstrating knowledge never worked well for me. My report cards showed average grades, which in our household might as well have been failures. "Why can't you apply yourself like your brother and sister?" became the soundtrack of my childhood, playing on repeat through elementary and middle school. My parents arranged for tutors, extended study hours, and punishments for anything less than a B grade. What they never considered was that I wasn't less intelligent, just differently intelligent. When I turned 12, I discovered computers and something clicked. The logical systems, the creative problem solving, the immediate feedback, all aligned perfectly with how my mind worked. I spent hours learning HTML, figuring out how websites functioned, taking apart and rebuilding old computers my dad's school was discarding. "Ali, stop wasting time playing on that computer and do your actual homework," my mother would say, completely dismissing the complex coding projects I was teaching myself. My father would walk past my room, glance at my screen filled with code, and shake his head disapprovingly. This isn't going to get you into college." By 14, I had built my first functional website for a local bakery owned by our neighbors. They paid me $50, which felt like a fortune. When I excitedly shared this accomplishment at dinner, my father barely looked up from his plate. "That's nice, but make sure it's not interfering with your schoolwork." His dismissal stung worse than any criticism could have. High school brought more of the same. While I managed to maintain B averages through sheer determination, my real education was happening after school hours. I taught myself JavaScript, Python, and database management through online resources and trial and error. My bedroom became a mini tech hub with parts and cables organized in labeled containers, a stark contrast to the academic chaos I couldn't seem to master. When graduation approached, the tensions at home reached a breaking point. College applications were the only topic my parents deemed worthy of discussion, but I had different plans. The technology landscape was evolving rapidly, and I knew firsthand experience would be more valuable than a degree that would leave me in debt for skills that might be outdated before graduation. The night I told my parents I wouldn't be applying to college was the first time I saw genuine disappointment replace their usual frustration. "You won't amount to anything without proper education," my father said, his voice cold and final. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." My mother's quiet, "We expected better from you," somehow cut deeper than my father's anger. The ultimatum came next, predictable and unyielding: go to college or be considered a family disappointment. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the technology that gave me purpose, I made my decision. If I couldn't earn their approval through their prescribed path, I would build my own road to success. I just didn't realize then how completely that decision would separate me from my family, or how painfully their rejection would manifest in the years to come. At 19, I moved out of my parents' house with nothing but my computer equipment, some clothes, and about $2,000 saved from odd tech repair jobs I'd done throughout high school. I found a small apartment with 2 roommates, Julia and Taylor, both college students who were rarely home. The place was cramped, and the neighborhood was far from the manicured suburbs I'd grown up in, but it was mine, and that freedom tasted sweeter than any comfort. My first steady job came from a local computer repair shop called Digital Fix. The owner, Ray, was impressed by my troubleshooting skills during the interview and hired me on the spot, though. The minimum wage payment barely covered my share of rent and utilities. What the job lacked in compensation, it made up for in practical experience. Every day brought new problems to solve, from virus removals to hardware failures, each one teaching me valuable skills no classroom could provide. "You have a knack for this," Ray would say after watching me diagnose a particularly tricky motherboard issue. "Most people with your skills have at least an associate degree." Those words meant more to me than any academic praise ever had. For the first time, my abilities were being recognized, not just my capacity to follow an educational blueprint designed by others. 3 months into the job, I met Gina Martinez, a regular customer who owned a small but growing web development company. She had brought in a server that kept overheating, and I not only fixed the immediate problem, but also suggested a configuration change that would prevent future issues. Before leaving, she handed me her business card. "We need someone who thinks like you do. Call me if you're ever looking for something beyond repair work." 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Gina's office, nervously explaining my lack of formal qualifications, but showcasing a portfolio of projects I'd built independently. By the end of the meeting, she had offered me a junior developer position with nearly double my current salary. More importantly, she became the mentor I had always needed. "Education comes in many forms," Gina told me during my first week. "Some of the most innovative thinkers in tech never finished college. What matters is your ability to solve problems and keep learning." Under her guidance, I specialized in creating accessible interfaces for users with disabilities, a growing niche within the industry. I worked longer hours than anyone else in the company, absorbing everything I could about business operations alongside technical skills. While my roommates spent weekends at parties, I dedicated mine to online courses and experimental projects. My financial situation remained tight. After rent, groceries, and setting aside a small emergency fund, there was little left over. My wardrobe consisted of basic items from discount stores, and eating out was a rare luxury. But for the first time in my life, the sacrifices felt worthwhile because they were in service to my own dreams, not someone else's expectations. Family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable. My parents would introduce my siblings with detailed descriptions of their academic and career achievements, while I was simply Allie, who's working with computers. When relatives asked about my work, my father would quickly change the subject, as if my career was something shameful rather than simply different. At Thanksgiving that year, my brother Thomas brought his new girlfriend, a law school classmate from a wealthy family. The entire dinner conversation revolved around bar exam preparation and prestigious firm opportunities. When I mentioned a challenging project I'd completed for a client with visual impairments, my mother smiled tightly and said, "That's nice, dear. Thomas, tell us more about that internship with Judge Williams." Despite these discouragements, my professional life flourished. After 18 months with Gina's company, I had built enough of a reputation to start taking freelance projects on the side. My client list grew steadily through referrals, each one impressed by my ability to translate technical solutions into user-friendly experiences. By my 21st birthday, my emergency savings had grown enough that I could survive for 3 months without income, if necessary a security I'd never known before. The idea for my own company came from a pattern I noticed while working on accessibility projects. The existing tools for making websites compliant with disability standards were clunky, expensive, and difficult to implement. I envisioned a streamlined solution that would automatically analyze and adjust websites for various accessibility needs, all without requiring extensive recoding. For 6 months, I spent every free moment developing a prototype. My tiny apartment became a development lab with sticky notes covering the walls and diagrams drawn on any available surface. My roommates thought I was becoming obsessed, but I could see the potential clearly, even when exhaustion made my vision blur. When the prototype was functional enough to demonstrate, I scheduled meetings with potential investors, mostly small angel investors, who specialized in accessibility technology. My first pitch meeting at age 22 was terrifying, my hands shaking as I connected my laptop to the projector. But once I began explaining the problem and my solution, something clicked. I wasn't just Allie, the college dropout anymore. I was Allie, the innovator, the problem solver. By the end of the presentation, I had secured $50,000 in seed funding, enough to refine the prototype and begin marketing to real clients. That Christmas, I arrived at my parents' house with a small gift and huge news. The family dinner started as usual, with Thomas discussing a high-profile case and Karen sharing her research breakthrough. When the conversation finally turned to me, I took a deep breath and shared my funding success and business launch plans. The silence that followed was deafening. My father set down his fork deliberately and fixed me with the look he reserved for underperforming students. "Playing entrepreneur with other people's money isn't a career plan, Allie," he said. "It's just delaying the inevitable failure that comes from lacking proper credentials." My mother nodded in agreement. "We just worry that you're setting yourself up for disappointment. It's not too late to apply to community college and get a proper education." Karen, always one to follow our parents' lead, added. Statistics show that most startups fail within the first year, especially those founded by people without business degrees. Only Thomas remained silent, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and concern. I left that night with my gift still wrapped in my bag, the excitement of my achievement completely deflated. On the drive back to my apartment, tears blurred my vision, but beneath the hurt, something hardened within me. Their disapproval would no longer define my worth. From that moment, I decided to prove them wrong, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed for taking an unconventional path. The next 2 years were a blur of 18-hour workdays, instant noodle dinners, and the kind of growth that comes from pushing yourself beyond what seems possible. My accessibility software, which I named Access Path, gained traction among small businesses looking to comply with digital accessibility standards without breaking their budgets. By age 23, I had enough consistent clients to lease a small office space in a converted warehouse and hire my first 2 employees, both talented programmers, who believed in the vision enough to accept modest starting salaries. I lived on the absolute minimum I could manage, channeling every spare dollar back into the business. My apartment remained sparse, my social life practically non-existent. While friends from high school posted photos of college graduations, travels abroad, and engagement announcements, I was debugging code at 2 a.m. and pitching to potential clients during every waking hour. The sacrifice was immense, but watching my company grow made it worthwhile. At 24, I was invited to speak at a regional tech conference about inclusive design. Standing on that stage, explaining concepts I had taught myself to a room full of industry professionals, I felt a confidence I'd never experienced before. People asked thoughtful questions, took notes on my recommendations, and approached me afterward for business cards. For the first time, I was being recognized as an authority in my field. That validation made the continued family skepticism even harder to bear. At my niece's baptism, surrounded by relatives congratulating Thomas and his wife on their beautiful baby and new house, my father cornered me by the refreshment table. "When are you going to get a real job, Allie?" he asked, keeping his voice low but his disapproval loud. "Running a little website business from a warehouse isn't a long-term plan. Thomas was made partner at 30, you know. That's what real success looks like." I tried explaining that my company had expanded its client base by 200% in the past year and was now serving businesses in 3 states, but his eyes glazed over. Technology concepts were foreign to him, and without the traditional markers of success, he understood my achievements remained invisible. My mother's approach was more subtle but equally painful. She would send me job postings for entry-level positions at established companies, always with a note saying, "Just in case you're ready for something more stable." Each email implied my current path was a temporary phase, something I would outgrow once I came to my senses. Even as my professional reputation grew, family gatherings became increasingly difficult to endure. My siblings would exchange knowing looks when I mentioned business challenges, as if they were just waiting for the inevitable failure my parents had predicted. Karen, now married to a fellow researcher and expecting their first child, seemed particularly invested in positioning her life choices as superior to mine. "It's so important to have credentials," she remarked during one dinner, not looking directly at me, but clearly aiming her words in my direction. "Jonathan and I are thinking of having our degrees framed for the baby's room as inspiration." The summer I turned 25 brought both triumph and crisis. A major hospital network had shown serious interest in implementing Access Path across their entire website system, a contract that would triple our annual revenue. Meetings progressed smoothly, contracts were drafted, and implementation plans created. Then 3 days before the final signing, they pulled out unexpectedly, citing budget constraints and restructuring. The financial strain was immediate and severe. I had already hired additional staff in anticipation of the new workload and invested in enhanced server capacity. For the first time since launching, I faced the real possibility of bankruptcy. Doubt crept in during sleepless nights, my father's predictions of failure echoing in my mind. Maybe they had been right all along. Maybe I had been foolish to think I could succeed without following their prescribed path. In desperation, I called Thomas, the only family member who occasionally showed genuine interest in my work. To my surprise, he agreed to meet for coffee the next day. Across the table from my successful, conventionally accomplished brother, I finally broke down, admitting how close I was to losing everything. Instead of the "I told you so," I half expected Thomas asked detailed questions about my business model, client base, and the technology itself. After an hour of discussion, he leaned back and sighed. "You're actually onto something significant here, Ali, but they'll never see it," he said, and I knew exactly who they were. Mum and Dad measure success by metrics they understand. Degrees, titles, houses in the right neighborhoods. They physically cannot comprehend what you're building. "So what do?" I asked, feeling both validated and defeated. "You stop looking for their approval," he said simply, "and you find a way through this setback because what you're creating has real value." Thomas didn't offer financial help, and I wouldn't have accepted it anyway. But that conversation gave me something more valuable, a renewed determination to succeed on my own terms. That night, I completely revamped our business approach, focusing on smaller clients who could implement quickly rather than large institutions with lengthy approval processes. Within 2 months, we had signed 20 new contracts, smaller individually, but collectively exceeding what the hospital deal would have provided. The true breakthrough came unexpectedly. While developing a custom solution for a client with unusual accessibility requirements, my team created a unique algorithm that automatically translated complex web elements into accessible formats without sacrificing design integrity. It was a technical achievement that solved one of the industry's most persistent challenges. Recognizing its potential, I immediately began the patent application process. Word spread quickly through industry channels, and suddenly the emails and calls were coming from much larger technology firms interested in licensing our innovation. After years of pushing the boulder uphill, it felt like we had finally reached a tipping point. When I shared this development with my parents during a rare phone call, my father's response was predictably dismissive. "Patents and technical jargon sound impressive, Ali, but without business fundamentals, you're building on sand. Your brother just purchased his second investment property, by the way." What he couldn't understand, what none of them could see, was that the landscape of success had changed. The technology world valued innovation over credentials, results over pedigree. While they remained fixated on conventional markers of achievement, I was quietly building something revolutionary, something that would soon change all our lives in ways none of us could have anticipated. The call that changed everything came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, just after my 28th birthday. The caller identified himself as Richard Dawson, Vice President of Acquisitions at Nexus Technologies, one of the largest software companies in the country. At first, I thought it was a sales call and nearly rushed him off the phone, a decision that would have altered the course of my life. "We've been monitoring your patent applications with great interest." Richard explained, his voice calm but clearly excited. "Your accessibility algorithm solves problems our team has been struggling with for years. We'd like to discuss acquisition options." The meeting was set for the following week at their headquarters in San Francisco. I spent every waking hour preparing, analyzing their company structure, recent acquisitions, and likely intentions. When I walked into their gleaming office tower, wearing the one professional outfit I owned, I felt like an imposter about to be exposed. But as the meeting progressed, it became clear that they weren't just interested, they were eager. "Your technology fits perfectly with our accessibility initiative," Richard explained as we sat in a conference room overlooking the bay. "We're prepared to offer $22 million for full acquisition of your company and patents." The number hit me like a physical force. $22 million. More money than I could comprehend. My expression must have revealed my shock, because Richard smiled kindly. "Take some time to consider the offer. We'll draw up the preliminary papers for you to review with your legal team." I didn't have a legal team. I had one overworked business attorney who helped with client contracts. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of meetings, document reviews, and late-night research sessions. I brought in the most experienced acquisition attorney I could find, spending nearly all my available cash on proper representation. The final terms included the full purchase price, a 1-year consulting contract to help integrate the technology, and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement about the specific terms of the sale. On the day I signed the final documents, I sat in my car afterward for nearly an hour staring at nothing. I was 28 years old and had just become a multimillionaire. The validation was sweeter than the money itself, proof that my unconventional path had been the right one all along. Yet I told no one about the exact amount, partly due to the NDA and partly because I wasn't ready for what would come next. The timing of this life-changing development coincided with a family crisis I couldn't have predicted. A week after the acquisition was finalized, Thomas called me, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Dad's retirement fund collapsed, he said without preamble. The investment firm he used was involved in some kind of fraud. They've lost almost everything. The details emerged slowly over the next few days. My father, always so confident in his financial decisions, had concentrated his retirement savings with a firm that promised exceptional returns. The firm had been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that finally collapsed, taking my parents' financial security with it. At 64, my father faced the prospect of losing their home and working well beyond his planned retirement age. Thomas and Karen had their own family's mortgages and financial obligations. While they offered what help they could, it wasn't enough to truly solve the crisis. I knew I could easily provide the money needed to secure my parents' retirement and save their house, but years of dismissal and disapproval made me hesitate. Would offering help be seen as genuine support, or would they view it as flaunting success they still didn't recognize as legitimate? I decided to approach the situation carefully, suggesting a family dinner to discuss options. What I didn't anticipate was how completely my parents' financial crisis had hardened rather than humbled them. I arrived at their house, the same middle-class suburban home where I'd grown up, to find them, Thomas and Karen, already seated around the dining table, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. The conversation began civilly enough, with my father explaining the situation in measured terms that barely contained his anger and humiliation. My mother kept wiping away tears, her usual composure crumbling under the weight of their new reality. Thomas and Karen outlined what they could contribute, amounts that would delay but not prevent the eventual loss of the house. When the attention turned to me, I carefully suggested that I might be able to help more substantially than expected, that my business had recently experienced significant success. What does that mean exactly? My father asked, skepticism evident in every syllable. Your little website company suddenly struck gold. I took a deep breath. Actually, yes. I recently sold the company and the patents we developed. I'm in a position to help significantly with your situation. The silence that followed was broken by my father's harsh laugh. You expect us to believe that your hobby business with no formal backing somehow sold for enough to solve our problems. Dad, I'm serious. I can show you the documentation. I reached for my bag, but he cut me off with a dismissive wave. We don't need financial advice or fairy tales from someone who couldn't even complete a basic education, he said, his voice rising. This family has real problems that require real solutions, not fantasies from someone who's been playing at business. My mother placed a restraining hand on his arm, but her eyes held the same doubt. Allie, we appreciate that you want to help, but perhaps this isn't the time for exaggerations. I felt my face flush with anger and hurt. It's not an exaggeration. I sold my company for $22 million. I can literally write you a check right now that would solve everything. The claim hung in the air, met with looks ranging from pity to outright disbelief. Karen actually rolled her eyes. $22 million. Come on, Allie, she said with the condescending tone she'd perfected over years of being the successful sister. If you want to help, just be honest about what you can actually contribute. Something inside me snapped. Years of dismissal, of having my choices questioned and my achievements minimized, crystallized into a single moment of clarity. These people, my own family, were so committed to their narrative of my failure that they couldn't recognize my success even when it was offered as their salvation. You know what? Forget it, I said, standing up. I've spent my entire life trying to earn your respect, trying to show you that there are different paths to success. But you're so trapped in your narrow definition that you can't even see what's right in front of you. My father stood as well, his face flushed with anger. Don't you dare lecture us about success. You're nothing but uneducated trash who got lucky with some computer games. We raised you for better than this, gave you every opportunity. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. Uneducated trash. the ultimate condemnation from a man who valued formal education above all else. James. My mother gasped but made no move to contradict him or defend me. No, Margaret. I'm done pretending. She comes in here with ridiculous claims trying to make us feel worse about our situation. Get out, you lowlife. He actually moved toward me, physically pushing me toward the door. We don't need your lies or your judgment. Get out of our house. Thomas half rose from his chair, but stopped at my look, a silent plea not to intervene. This moment of truth between my father and me had been building for years. Karen simply watched wide-eyed but silent as always, aligning herself with our parents. As I stood on the porch, the door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed through my entire body. Through the window, I could see them huddled together, the perfect family unit, minus the disappointing member. I walked to my car in a daze, tears streaming down my face, despite my determination not to cry. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of pain and anger so intense it felt physical. By the time I pulled into my parking space, one thought had crystallized through the emotional storm. I was done seeking approval from people who were constitutionally incapable of giving it. $22 million would buy a lot of things, but the most valuable would be a fresh start, far from the shadows of expectations I could never meet. The oceanfront property in Malibu wasn't a practical purchase, but after years of practical decisions and frugal living, I allowed myself this one extravagance. The glass and cedar structure perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific became my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of the freedom I had earned through years of work and sacrifice. I spent the first month customizing every detail, creating spaces filled with light technology and comfort, the antithesis of the rigid traditional home where I'd grown up. The beach house represented more than just a place to live. It was a declaration of independence, a space entirely my own where no one's judgment could reach me. Each morning, I woke to the sound of waves and the knowledge that I had built this life on my own terms. The emotional healing proved more challenging than creating a beautiful home. Despite the vindication of my success, the wounds from that final confrontation ran deep. I found myself rehearsing conversations with my parents in my head, imagining all the things I should have said, the proof I should have provided. Some nights I would wake from dreams where I was back in that dining room, my father's words echoing through my unconscious mind. Uneducated trash, lowlife. To process the trauma, I started seeing Dr. Samantha Rivera, a therapist specializing in family relationship issues. Our weekly sessions became anchors in a time of emotional turbulence. Family rejection creates a uniquely painful type of grief, she explained during one session. You're mourning the relationship you deserved, but never had, while simultaneously processing the acute trauma of their explicit rejection. Through therapy, I began to understand that my parents' inability to recognize my success wasn't really about me at all. It reflected their own rigid worldview, their fear of paths they didn't understand, and perhaps even unconscious jealousy of my freedom from traditional expectations. The hardest part of healing will be accepting that you cannot change them, Dr. Rivera cautioned. You can only change how their behavior affects you. Your worth isn't determined by their ability to see it. While working through these emotional challenges, I focused on building a life rich with genuine connections. I joined entrepreneur groups, made friends with neighbors, and reconnected with Gina, my early mentor, who was delighted by my success. Unlike my biological family, these people saw me clearly and valued me for exactly who I was. I also channeled my energy into creating something meaningful from my newfound wealth. Having experienced firsthand how traditional education systems fail many types of thinkers, I established a foundation to support alternative learning paths for young people interested in technology. The Diverse Pathways Foundation provided scholarships, mentorship, and resources for students who, like me, might excel outside conventional academic environments. In developing the foundation, I discovered a purpose beyond financial success. Each young person who found their path through our programs represented a victory against the narrow definitions of potential that had nearly crushed my own spirit. Their successes became extensions of mine, proof that different doesn't mean deficient. While building this new life, I maintained a minimal social media presence, sharing occasional photos of beach sunsets or foundation events, without revealing the full extent of my new circumstances. I had no desire to flaunt wealth or success, particularly as a form of revenge. True vindication would come from living well, not from proving anything to those who had rejected me. 3 weeks after the disastrous family dinner, reality began catching up with my parents. According to Thomas, who called occasionally to check on me, their financial situation had deteriorated rapidly. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on their house, and my father's attempts to secure loans had been rejected due to his age and lack of income. My mother had taken a part-time teaching position, but the salary barely covered their basic expenses, let alone the mortgage payments needed to save their home. I expected to feel satisfaction at their predicament, perhaps even a vindictive pleasure that karma had finally balanced the scales. Instead, I felt a complicated mix of empathy for their genuine distress and frustration that it had taken a crisis of this magnitude to potentially break through their rigid perspectives. The call from Thomas came on a Wednesday afternoon as I sat on my deck working on foundation proposals. "Ali, how are you doing?" His voice carried the careful tone of someone approaching a wounded animal. "I'm good, actually. Really good." And surprisingly, it wasn't a lie. A pause. "That's great to hear. Listen, things have gotten worse with Mom and Dad. They've got 30 days before the bank takes the house." I said nothing, waiting for what I knew was coming. "Karen and I have pulled what we can, but it's not enough. Dad's too proud to declare bankruptcy and Mom's falling apart." Another pause. "They've been asking about you." "Asking what exactly?" My voice remained steady despite the sudden acceleration of my pulse. "Where you're living now, what you're doing. I think they're realizing they might have misjudged your situation." The understatement was almost laughable. "Did you tell them about my beach house, Thomas?" "I mentioned you'd moved to California and were doing well." A hesitation. "Look, I'm not asking you to help them after how they treated you. I just thought you should know what's happening." But we both recognized the implicit request. After we hung up, I spent hours walking along the shore, watching waves crash against rocks and retreat again and again, a physical representation of the emotional tide pulling at me. Could I forgive decades of dismissal and that final cruel rejection? Should I didn't reach a definitive answer that day or the next. Instead, I focused on clarifying my own boundaries. If reconciliation were to happen, it would need to be on terms that protected my hard-won self-respect and acknowledged the reality of who I truly was, not who they had wanted me to be. A week later, Thomas called again, his voice tight with strain. "Dad asked for your address. They want to come see you." "Did they say why?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "They said they want to reconnect, but..." He trailed off. "But they need money." I finished for him. "Yeah, probably." I gave him my address without further discussion. Whether their visit was motivated by genuine regret or financial desperation, I was finally ready to face them on my own territory, secure in the knowledge of my worth, regardless of their ability to recognize it. The doorbell rang precisely at noon on Saturday, exactly when they had said they would arrive. Some habits like punctuality were too deeply ingrained in my parents to be affected even by life-altering circumstances. I took a deep breath, smoothed down the simple but expensive dress I had chosen for this encounter, and opened the door to my past. They stood awkwardly on my doorstep, looking simultaneously familiar and like strangers. My father had aged dramatically in just a few weeks, new lines etched into his face by stress and humiliation. My mother seemed smaller somehow, her usual perfect posture compromised by the weight of their situation. Both stared past me at the soaring ceilings and ocean view visible through the entryway, their expressions shifting from prepared dignity to undisguised shock. "Ali," my mother finally said, recovering first. "Thank you for seeing us. Your home is unexpected." "Please come in," I replied, stepping aside to let them enter. I had deliberately not prepared what to say, choosing instead to respond authentically to whatever approach they took. They moved tentatively into my living room, eyes darting from the custom furniture to the state-of-the-art technology integrated throughout the space to the uninterrupted ocean views through walls of glass. I gestured toward the comfortable seating area and offered them drinks, falling into the role of hostess rather than estranged daughter. "This is quite a place," my father said finally, his tone hovering between admiration and suspicion. "Must be expensive." I nodded but offered no figures. "I enjoy it. Would you like a tour before we talk?" The tour served multiple purposes, allowing us to interact without immediate confrontation, while also establishing the undeniable reality of my success. As they followed me through the house, taking in the professional kitchen, the home office with multiple monitors displaying foundation projects, the guest suites, and finally the infinity pool overlooking the ocean, their perception of me visibly shifted. The fantasy they had dismissed at the dinner table now stood in concrete reality around them. When we returned to the living room and settled with drinks, an awkward silence fell. They had clearly not anticipated this level of success, and their prepared approach, whatever it had been, no longer seemed adequate. You have a beautiful home. My mother finally offered, her voice small. Thomas mentioned you were doing well, but we didn't realize. How well? I finished for her. No, I don't suppose you did. My father cleared his throat, always the one to take control of difficult conversations. Allie, we want to apologize for how things ended at our last meeting. I said things in anger that were inappropriate. Not cruel, not false, merely inappropriate. The careful wording spoke volumes. We've had time to reflect, my mother added quickly, and realize we may have been too quick to dismiss your business accomplishments. The understatement might have been funny in different circumstances. $22 million of understatement. I appreciate that, I said neutrally, waiting to see where they would take this rehearsed reconciliation attempt. My father shifted uncomfortably, then apparently decided to address the obvious. I assume Thomas has told you about our situation. I nodded. He mentioned the foreclosure proceedings. We've exhausted all conventional options. He continued, the word conventional hanging between us like an unintended commentary on our fundamental difference in approaches. Our retirement savings are gone, the house will be taken within weeks, and at my age, employment opportunities are limited. What are you planning to do? I asked, maintaining a conversational tone despite the tension crackling beneath the surface. My parents exchanged glances, a married couple's silent communication. My mother took over, always the diplomatic one. We're exploring all possibilities. Downsizing certainly, though the current market makes selling difficult. Perhaps a rental situation temporarily. She hesitated, then added with forced casualness. We were hoping you might have suggestions given your apparent financial expertise. Not an outright request for money, but the implication was clear. I studied them. These people who had shaped me through both nurturing and negation, and felt a strange calm. The power dynamic had shifted, but I took no pleasure in their vulnerability or my newfound position of strength. What I wanted wasn't revenge, but recognition, not just of my financial success, but of my worth as a person who had chosen a different path. Before we discuss potential solutions, I said carefully, I need to ask you something. If my company hadn't sold, if I was still running my little website business, as you called it, would you be here today? Would you be interested in reconciliation? The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. My father's face flushed, but my mother reached over to take his hand, a restraining gesture I recognized from childhood. That's not a fair question, Allie, she protested. Of course we would want to reconnect with you regardless of your financial situation. You're our daughter. Am I because 3 weeks ago Dad called me uneducated trash and physically pushed me out of your house? Those aren't actions directed at a valued family member. My father's flush deepened. I was under tremendous stress. You know I didn't mean those things literally. I think you did mean them, I countered, keeping my voice steady. I think you've always seen my choices as a rejection of your values and by extension, a rejection of you. And maybe they were in some ways, but that doesn't make them wrong or worthless. We only wanted what was best for you, my mother insisted, tears forming in her eyes. A secure future respect in your field, the things that come with proper credentials. And yet here I am, I said, gesturing to the house around us, with security and respect earned through means you couldn't understand or accept. That's the irony, isn't it? While you were dismissing my path as invalid, it was actually leading to exactly the outcomes you wanted for me, just via a route you couldn't recognize. My father, never comfortable with emotional confrontations, shifted to practical matters. Allie, we can discuss our past misunderstandings at length another time. Right now, we're facing an immediate crisis. We need help, and Thomas indicated you might be in a position to provide it. There it was, finally, the direct request. I took a deep breath. Yes, I can help you financially. As I tried to tell you at dinner, I sold my company and patents for $22 million last month, even though they were sitting in the physical evidence of my claim. The actual number still visibly shocked them. My father's mouth actually opened slightly before he caught himself. $22 million, he repeated, as if saying it aloud might make it more comprehensible. From the accessibility software. Yes, it solved problems that much larger companies with traditionally educated teams couldn't crack. Turns out, innovation sometimes happens outside the established pathways. My mother wiped away a tear. We had no idea. We thought perhaps you'd had some moderate success, not this. You never asked, I said simply. You never really wanted to know what I was building because it didn't fit your definition of achievement. My father, practical as always, seemed to be mentally calculating. And you'd be willing to help us with our situation, perhaps a loan until we can reorganize our finances. I'm willing to consider it, I answered carefully. But first, I need something from you. Of course, anything, my mother said quickly, too quickly. I need you to understand that this isn't just about money. It's about respect, recognition that my path, though, different from what you planned, was valid. That I'm not uneducated trash or a lowlife regardless of my bank balance. My father had the grace to look ashamed. Those words were inexcusable, spoken in anger, but deeply wrong. I apologize unreservedly. It was the most genuine thing he'd said since arriving. I nodded, accepting, but not quite forgiving yet. If I help you, there will be conditions, I continued. First, it would be a loan with proper documentation, not a gift. You would make reasonable payments based on your actual ability to pay. They nodded relief, beginning to show through their carefully maintained composure. Second, we would need to work with a family therapist to address the patterns that led us here. I'm not interested in a financial transaction that leaves the underlying issues unresolved. This condition clearly made them uncomfortable, but they nodded again. Finally, I need genuine acceptance, not just politeness motivated by financial need. That means respecting my choices, acknowledging the validity of my success, and treating me as an equal adult rather than a disappointing child. My mother reached out tentatively to touch my hand. We can do that, Allie. I think we're already beginning to see how wrong we were. My father nodded, though, with more reservation. Changing the perspectives of a lifetime wouldn't happen in a single conversation, no matter how powerful the evidence before him. Then yes, I'll help you, I said finally. We'll work out the details with proper legal oversight, but your home will be secure. The relief that washed over them was palpable, their bodies physically relaxing as the immediate threat to their security lifted. But I wasn't finished. But I want to be very clear about something. This help doesn't come with any obligation for me to conform to your expectations going forward. I built my success my way, and I'll continue living my life according to my own values. My father, traditional patriarch, that he was clearly struggled with this declaration of independence paired with financial rescue. But he nodded, perhaps understanding for the first time that our relationship had fundamentally changed. I was no longer a child seeking approval, but an adult offering help on my own terms. As they prepared to leave several hours later, preliminary arrangements discussed and boundaries established, my mother hugged me tentatively. "We're proud of you, Allie," she said, her voice carrying the weight of belated recognition. "Not because of the money, but because you stayed true to your vision despite everything, including our lack of faith." It wasn't complete healing, not yet. But as I watched them drive away smaller figures in my rear view than they had ever been before, I felt the first real hope that we might eventually build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed, something based on mutual respect rather than authority and conformity. Not because I had money now, but because circumstances had finally forced them to see me, the real me who had been there all along. 8 months have passed since that day my parents showed up at my beach house, their pride temporarily overcome by desperation. The journey since then has been neither simple nor straight, but marked by genuine progress interspersed with inevitable setbacks. True healing, I've learned, isn't a single moment of revelation, but a series of small steps forward, occasional steps back, and the commitment to keep moving toward understanding regardless. As promised, I provided a formal loan to save their house, structured by financial advisors, to include reasonable payments based on their actual income. The paperwork itself represented an important shift, treating our arrangement as an adult business transaction, rather than a parental handout or child's obligation. My father, initially uncomfortable with this reversal of traditional roles, eventually came to appreciate the dignity and respect inherent in these clear boundaries. The family therapy sessions proved more challenging than the financial arrangements. Dr. Elaine Morrison, a specialist in family dynamics, skillfully navigated our first awkward meetings, where decades of unspoken expectations and disappointments finally found voice. My father struggled most with articulating emotions, his lifelong habit of authoritative pronouncements, inadequate for the vulnerable conversations healing required. "I never understood why our dreams for you weren't enough," he admitted during our third session, the closest he had ever come to revealing personal hurt beneath professional disapproval. "Because they were your dreams, Dad, not mine," I replied, finding compassion where anger had once dominated. "I needed you to see who I actually was, not who you thought I should be." My mother proved more adaptable, her natural empathy emerging once freed from the rigid family structure. During a private lunch following a particularly difficult therapy session, she made a confession that shifted my understanding of our family history. "I always secretly admired your courage," she said, carefully stirring her tea. "I was raised to believe security came only through traditional paths, and I was too afraid to question that, even for myself. Watching you forge your own way terrified me because it forced me to confront my own lack of courage." These moments of genuine connection didn't erase the past, but they began building bridges toward a different kind of relationship, one between equals, rather than authority figures and a subordinate child. My siblings responded differently to the dramatic shift in family dynamics. Karen initially maintained distance, perhaps threatened by the disruption to the established hierarchy in which her traditional achievements had granted her favored status. Thomas, however, became an unexpected ally, having already begun questioning some of the family's fundamental values before my financial success made them impossible to ignore. Beyond my immediate family, I found profound fulfillment in expanding the Diverse Pathways Foundation. What began as a personal response to my own educational challenges grew into a comprehensive program supporting hundreds of young people through alternative learning paths. We established coding bootcamps, apprenticeship programs, and mentorship networks, specifically designed for creative thinkers who, like me, might thrive outside traditional academic environments. Speaking at educational conferences became a regular part of my schedule, sharing both my business journey and the philosophical insights it had generated. Standing before audiences of educators, parents, and students, I could articulate the message I had once so desperately needed to hear, that success has many definitions, that different cognitive styles represent diversity rather than deficiency, and that innovation often emerges precisely where convention is questioned. The most valuable skills in tomorrow's economy aren't memorization or conformity. I told a conference of high school counselors, but critical thinking, creative problem solving, and the courage to pursue unique insights. Some of your most promising students may be the ones struggling most with your current systems. The foundation work provided something my business success alone had not: a sense of purpose beyond personal vindication. Each student who found their path through our programs represented a small victory against the limiting beliefs that had nearly crushed my own potential. Their successes became extensions of mine, proof that different doesn't mean deficient. My personal healing journey continued in parallel with these professional developments. Regular therapy helped me recognize how deeply my parents' dismissal had affected my self-perception, creating a persistent need to prove my worth through achievement. Gradually, I learned to separate my intrinsic value from external validation, finding confidence that existed independently of others' approval. Financial success brought its own challenges and opportunities for growth. After the initial purchase of my beach house, I approached wealth with intentional thoughtfulness, developing investment strategies focused on supporting innovative companies with diverse leadership. Luxury remained a minimal part of my lifestyle, with the exception of creating beautiful spaces that nourished creativity and connection. New business ventures emerged organically from this period of reflection. Rather than returning to the corporate technology world, I established a small innovation lab focused on developing accessibility solutions for underserved populations. The work provided intellectual stimulation without the all-consuming demands of my earlier entrepreneurial phase, allowing space for the personal growth and relationships I had previously sacrificed. Today, my relationship with my parents exists in a delicate balance of cautious connection and clear boundaries. We speak weekly, meet monthly, and navigate a new territory between the artificial closeness of our past and the complete rupture that nearly became our future. The loan payments arrive punctually each month, a small but significant reminder of our new dynamic. My father still occasionally slips into old patterns of judgment, particularly when discussing my unorthodox business approaches or foundation work. But these moments now prompt conversations rather than confrontations. His perspective softened by the undeniable evidence of my success and my own confidence no longer dependent on his approval. During their most recent visit, as we walked along the beach below my house, my father paused to watch the sunset, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Allie, I spent my entire career believing there was one right path to success," he said, eyes on the horizon. "I taught thousands of students that message. I wonder now how many I might have limited without realizing it." It wasn't a complete transformation, but it represented something I had once thought impossible growth beyond the rigid boundaries that had defined him. In that moment, I felt something shift within myself as well, a deeper healing that came not from being right or successful, but from being truly seen. The journey from being called uneducated trash to finding this fragile piece has taught me that true success isn't measured in dollars or achievements, but in the courage to define your own path regardless of others' understanding. Money can solve practical problems, but only authenticity can heal the deeper wounds of rejection and misunderstanding. For those watching who might be facing similar struggles with family expectations or conventional definitions of success, remember that your worth isn't determined by others' ability to recognize it. Sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is continuing to believe in your vision when no one else does. And sometimes the most powerful response to rejection isn't revenge, but creating a life so authentically successful that it expands others' understanding of what's possible. Has your family ever dismissed your dreams or called you names that hurt deeply? How did you handle it, and what would you do if they came back, needing your help? Please share your experiences in the comments below and subscribe to hear more stories about finding strength after rejection. Remember, the people who truly belong in your life are those who believe in you before success proves them right. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the courage to keep building your own path even when others can't yet see where it leads.